the winter of 1848, 19 gold miners vanished into the Sierra Nevada mountains near Sacramento, cut off from civilization by the worst snowstorm in California history. 4 months later, when a rescue team finally reached their camp, they found only 6 men alive. The bodies of 13 miners had been systematically butchered and consumed. But what horrified investigators most wasn't the cannibalism itself. It was the detailed ledger showing how the survivors had voted on who would die next. Before we descend into the horror that consumed the Wilson Creek mining camp, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest truths hidden in America's past. If you're one of the few who can handle these dark revelations, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover the stories that others dare not tell. Now, let's journey back to 1848, when the California gold rush promised fortune but delivered something far more sinister. The California gold rush of 1848 transformed the American West overnight, drawing hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers from around the world to the Sierra Nevada foothills. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in January of that year triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history, with people abandoning homes, families, and established lives for the chance to strike it rich in California's gold fields. By autumn of 1848, an estimated 40,000 miners were scattered throughout the Sierra Nevada, living in hastily constructed camps, enduring brutal conditions, and competing desperately for claims that might yield the fortune they had traveled so far to find. Most of these miners were woefully unprepared for the realities of life in the mountains. They came from cities and farms, from comfortable lives back east, or from distant countries, and they had no experience with the harsh conditions of the Sierra Nevada. They underestimated the severity of the winters, the difficulty of obtaining supplies in remote locations, and the countless dangers that awaited them in the wilderness. Many died from accidents, disease, exposure, or violence, but some faced fates far worse than simple death. The Wilson Creek mining camp was established in October of 1848 by a group of 19 men who had pooled their resources to work a promising claim, approximately 30 miles northeast of Sacramento, high in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The group was led by Jonathan Whitfield, a 38-year-old former merchant from Boston who had arrived in California in the spring with dreams of wealth and a determination to succeed where others had failed. Whitfield was an educated man, organized and methodical, and he had convinced 18 other miners to join his venture by promising that collective effort would yield better results than individual prospecting. The group included men from various backgrounds and regions. There were farm boys from the Midwest seeking adventure and fortune. There were experienced laborers who had worked in mines back east and believed their skills would translate to gold fields. There were immigrants from Germany and Ireland who had come to America specifically to join the gold rush. There were former sailors who had jumped ship in San Francisco Harbor, and there were desperate men fleeing failed businesses or troubled pasts, seeing California as their last chance at redemption. The Wilson Creek claim was located in a narrow canyon where a small creek descended from the higher elevations. The location showed promising signs of gold deposits, with several productive pannings convincing the group that they had found a potentially rich claim. They spent October and early November constructing a substantial camp, building 3 large cabins to house the 19 men, establishing a cooking area, and beginning the systematic work of extracting gold from the creek bed and surrounding terrain. By mid-November, the group had extracted a modest but encouraging amount of gold, enough to convince them that continued work would yield significant profits. They had also established a routine for obtaining supplies from Sacramento, with 2 men making the 30-mile journey every 2 weeks to purchase food, tools, and other necessities. The arrangement seemed sustainable, and the men settled into the hard but hopeful work of mining, believing that the winter months would bring continued success. But California weather had other plans. On November 28, 1848, the first major snowstorm of the season struck the Sierra Nevada with unprecedented fury. Snow began falling in the early morning and continued without pause for 3 days, accumulating at a rate that astonished even experienced mountain men. By the time the storm finally cleared on December 1st, over 6 feet of snow blanketed the Wilson Creek camp, and the temperature had plummeted to levels that made outdoor work nearly impossible. The miners, who had been planning to send their regular supply run to Sacramento, found themselves completely cut off from civilization. The trail they had been using was now buried under deep snow, and the terrain had become impassable for men on foot. Whitfield, assessing their situation, calculated that they had approximately 6 weeks of food supplies if they rationed carefully. He assured the group that the snow would eventually melt enough to allow travel, and that they simply needed to conserve their resources and wait for conditions to improve. What none of them realized was that the storm they had just experienced was merely the beginning of what would become the most severe winter in California's recorded history. Throughout December, storm after storm pounded the Sierra Nevada, each depositing additional feet of snow and further isolating the Wilson Creek camp. The temperature remained brutally cold, and the snow depth reached levels that made any thought of travel suicidal. The miners, trapped in their cabins, could do nothing but watch their food supplies dwindle and hope that the weather would eventually break. By early January of 1849, the food situation had become critical. The camp's supplies, which had been calculated to last 6 weeks with rationing, were nearly exhausted after 5 weeks of careful management. The men were consuming minimal portions of dried meat, beans and flour, supplementing their diet with whatever small game they could trap or shoot near the camp. But the deep snow had driven most animals to lower elevations, and hunting yielded almost nothing. The men were growing weak, their bodies beginning to show the effects of prolonged malnutrition. Jonathan Whitfield, maintaining his role as leader and organizer, called a meeting of all 19 men on January 10th. The situation, he explained, had become desperate. Their food would last perhaps another week at most. No significant game had been found in over 2 weeks. The snow showed no signs of melting, and attempting to hike out to Sacramento through the deep snow and bitter cold would be suicide. They needed to discuss their options and make decisions about how to proceed. The options, as Whitfield outlined them, were grim. They could attempt to send a small group of the strongest men to Sacramento for help, though the likelihood of success was minimal, and the attempt would cost precious energy that starving men could not spare. They could remain in camp and hope that the weather would break soon enough for them to survive on their remaining supplies and whatever minimal game they could find. Or they could consider more extreme measures to ensure that at least some of them survived until rescue or escape became possible. It was during this meeting that the first mention of cannibalism was raised, though not by Whitfield himself. One of the miners, a German immigrant named Friedrich Handel, suggested that if men died from starvation or cold, their bodies could provide sustenance for the survivors. The suggestion was met with immediate revulsion from most of the group, with several men declaring that they would rather die than engage in such an abomination. But a few voices, weakened by hunger and driven by desperation, pointed out that eating the dead to ensure the survival of the living was not murder, merely a practical response to impossible circumstances. Whitfield, showing the organizational skills that had made him the group's leader, proposed a compromise that he claimed would preserve both their humanity and their chances of survival. If men died naturally from starvation, cold, or illness, their bodies would be preserved in the snow and could be used as food by the survivors. This practice, he argued, had been employed by other groups trapped in similar circumstances and was not considered murder or even particularly immoral when survival was at stake. The group would not kill anyone. They would simply acknowledge the reality that some would die regardless of what they did, and that those deaths need not doom the others. After hours of anguished debate, the group voted on Whitfield's proposal. 14 men voted in favor, reasoning that they were merely planning for an inevitable tragedy rather than agreeing to murder. 5 men, horrified by the very idea, voted against it, but the majority had spoken, and the pact was established. If men died, their bodies would be used to sustain the survivors. Whitfield even began keeping a written record of the agreement, documenting who had voted for and against the measure, as if the careful documentation would somehow make the decision more civilized or morally defensible. The first death occurred on January 15th, barely 5 days after the fateful meeting. Peter Sullivan, a 19-year-old farm boy from Ohio, had been the youngest and physically weakest member of the group. He had been growing progressively more ill throughout the early part of January, suffering from what appeared to be pneumonia, combined with severe malnutrition. Despite the limited medical care the group could provide, Sullivan's condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died in the night, his body discovered by his cabin mates in the morning. According to the records that would later be discovered, Whitfield immediately took charge of the situation. Sullivan's body was carried outside and laid in the snow to preserve it. Whitfield then called another meeting to discuss how to proceed. The group, now consisting of 18 living men and 1 corpse, faced the reality of their agreement. Several men, despite having voted for the pact, now expressed horror at the thought of actually consuming human flesh, but others, driven by hunger and fear, argued that they had already made their decision, and that backing out now would mean Sullivan's death had no purpose. In the end, desperation won over revulsion. Whitfield, maintaining his role as organizer, directed several of the men to butcher Sullivan's body in the same manner they would butcher any animal for food. The work was done outside, away from the cabins, with the men who performed it later reporting that it was the most horrifying task they had ever undertaken. The body was divided into portions, with the meat being cooked and distributed among the 18 survivors. The consumption of Peter Sullivan's flesh marked a psychological threshold that once crossed could never be recrossed. The men who ate that first meal of human meat reported that it was surprisingly similar to pork in taste and texture. The nourishment it provided was undeniable, giving the starving men energy and strength they had not felt in weeks. And once the initial horror had passed, a terrible pragmatism began to take hold in the camp. They had crossed the line, they had become cannibals, and the question that began to form in some minds was not whether they could continue, but rather how they could ensure a steady supply of sustenance. The second death occurred on January 22nd, just 1 week after Peter Sullivan. Thomas O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had been ill with fever, succumbed during the night. His body was processed and consumed with less hesitation than Sullivan's had been. The men were becoming accustomed to their new reality, and the line between necessity and murder was beginning to blur in ways that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. But it was the third death that revealed the true horror of what the Wilson Creek camp was becoming. On January 28th, William Porter, a 42-year-old miner from Pennsylvania, died in his sleep. The official cause, as recorded in Whitfield's journal, was heart failure, brought on by malnutrition and cold. But several of the surviving men would later testify that Porter had been in relatively good health compared to others in the camp, and that his sudden death struck them as suspicious. Some began to wonder if the line between allowing death and causing death had already been crossed. By early February, 13 days after Porter's death, the camp had lost 4 men total, and the dynamic among the survivors had shifted in disturbing ways. The men were no longer simply enduring hardship together. They were eyeing each other with a mixture of suspicion and calculation, wondering who would die next, and whether that death would be natural or assisted. Whitfield continued to maintain order and to keep his detailed journal, but some of the entries suggest that he himself was beginning to rationalize more active measures to ensure survival. The journal entries from this period, which would later be entered into evidence, show a progressive moral deterioration. Whitfield wrote about evaluating which men were weakest, and therefore most likely to die soon. He calculated how much meat each body would provide, and how long it would sustain the remaining survivors. He even began to theorize about optimal group size, suggesting that fewer survivors meant more food per person and better chances of making it through the winter. The organized merchant from Boston was becoming something far darker, and his leadership was transforming from guidance to something approaching orchestrated murder. On February 8th, the camp held another meeting, and this time the discussion was more explicit. 5 men had died in 4 weeks, and 12 remained alive. The snow showed no signs of melting, and escape remained impossible. Whitfield proposed what he called a logical solution to their predicament. Instead of waiting for random deaths to provide sustenance, they should establish a system for selecting who would die next, based on rational criteria, such as physical weakness, lack of skills useful for survival, or simple lottery, if necessary. This way, he argued, they could ensure that the strongest and most capable men survived, maximizing the chance that someone would make it out to tell their story. The proposal was met with shock and resistance from roughly half the remaining men. They argued that what Whitfield was proposing was murder, that it crossed a line from survival cannibalism to something far more evil. But the other half, weakened by starvation and increasingly desperate, began to see a terrible logic in Whitfield's argument. If some had to die so others could live, wasn't it more rational to choose who died, rather than leaving it to chance? After hours of debate, marked by anger, tears, and expressions of horror, the group voted. 7 men voted in favor of Whitfield's selection system, 5 voted against it. The decision was made, and the Wilson Creek mining camp took its final step from tragedy to systematic murder. What had begun as a desperate group of miners trapped by weather had transformed into something history would remember with horror: a cannibal camp where men voted on who would die to feed the others. The journal that Whitfield kept would later document exactly what happened next, providing investigators with a detailed record of organized murder and cannibalism that would shock California and the nation. But in that frozen canyon, in February of 1849, the remaining 12 men were simply trying to survive, even if survival meant becoming monsters. The decision to establish a selection system for determining who would die next marked the transformation of the Wilson Creek camp from a site of tragic survival cannibalism into something far more sinister, an organized killing operation where men voted on murder. What happened over the following 8 weeks would become one of the most disturbing chapters in California gold rush history, a period during which 12 men became 6 through a process that combined democratic procedure with calculated slaughter. Jonathan Whitfield, having secured majority approval for his selection system, immediately established the rules that would govern who lived and who died. The system he proposed was presented as rational and fair, though the very concept of fairness in choosing murder victims reveals how completely the group's moral framework had collapsed. Whitfield argued that the selection should be based on objective criteria that would maximize the survival chances of the group as a whole. The weakest men, those least able to contribute to eventual escape or rescue, would be selected first. Men with critical skills, such as hunting, navigation, or medical knowledge, would be protected as long as possible, and if criteria proved insufficient to make a clear choice, lots would be drawn to ensure that the process remained impartial. The 12 remaining men were divided into 2 groups: the 7 who had voted for the selection system, and the 5 who had opposed it. This division would prove significant in ways that became clear only gradually. The 5 who had voted against the system found themselves vulnerable in a way the others were not. They had already demonstrated their unwillingness to participate in what the majority now viewed as necessary survival measures, and this made them suspect in the eyes of men who had committed fully to doing whatever it took to live through the winter. The first man selected under the new system was Marcus Brennan, a 34-year-old laborer from New York, who had been one of the 5 to vote against Whitfield's proposal. Brennan was not the weakest man in camp by any means, but he had made the mistake of continuing to voice moral objections to the selection system, even after it had been approved by majority vote. On February 10th, just 2 days after the vote that established the system, Whitfield called a meeting and proposed that Brennan be the first selected based on what he termed divisive behavior that threatened group cohesion and survival. The vote was swift and decisive. The 7 who had originally supported the selection system all voted for Brennan's selection. Of the remaining 4 men who had voted against the system, 3 abstained from voting, perhaps recognizing that resistance was futile and might make them the next targets. One man, David Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had been working the gold fields for nearly a year before joining the Wilson Creek camp, voted against selecting Brennan and argued that the entire process was murder regardless of how they justified it. His courage in speaking out would prove to be his death sentence, though he did not know it yet. Brennan's execution occurred that same evening. According to the journal entries and the later testimony of survivors, Whitfield determined that the killing should be done quickly and with minimal suffering, both to preserve the moral pretense that this was a regrettable necessity rather than murder, and to ensure that the meat was not damaged or contaminated by prolonged struggle. Brennan was taken outside under the pretense of helping gather firewood. 3 of the strongest men accompanied him, and once they were away from the cabins, they attacked him from behind. Death came by strangulation combined with blows to the head, methods that Whitfield had apparently chosen based on his research into butchering practices. The body was processed that same night, and the meat distributed among the 11 survivors. The men ate in silence, and several later reported that consuming Brennan's flesh felt fundamentally different from consuming the bodies of men who had died naturally. They had crossed another threshold, one that made them not just survivors who had resorted to cannibalism, but active murderers who killed to eat. Some of the men wept as they ate. Others maintained a grim determination, convincing themselves that they were simply doing what had to be done. And a few, including Whitfield himself, seemed to have moved beyond guilt into a cold pragmatism that justified any action in the name of survival. 3 days later, on February 13th, David Chen became the 2nd man selected for execution. His vote against Brennan's killing and his continued moral objections made him an obvious target for a group that could no longer afford internal dissent. The vote was again decisive, with the original 7 supporters of the system voting for Chen's selection. Chen, realizing what was coming, attempted to flee the camp on foot, running out into the deep snow in a desperate attempt to escape. He made it less than 100 yards before the men pursuing him caught up. His death was less clean than Brennan's had been, with the struggle in the snow leaving the body damaged in ways that made processing more difficult, but the result was the same. Another man dead, another source of meat for the survivors. By mid-February, 9 men remained alive, and the camp had settled into a horrifying routine. Every 4 to 5 days, another selection meeting would be held. Whitfield would assess the food situation and propose that another man be chosen. The group would vote, with the outcome increasingly predictable as the original supporters of the system maintained their majority. The selected man would be executed, usually through strangulation or blows to the head. Though one man was stabbed when he fought back against his executioners, the body would be butchered and the meat preserved in the snow or cooked immediately, depending on immediate needs versus long-term planning. The journal entries from this period show Whitfield's complete moral deterioration. He wrote detailed descriptions of how each body was processed, noting which cuts provided the most meat and which organs were most nutritious. He calculated consumption rates and projected how long the current group could survive based on killing one man every 5 days. He even began to categorize the remaining men by their usefulness, creating what amounted to a ranked list of who would die in what order. The educated merchant from Boston had become something that history would struggle to categorize, not a madman driven by insanity, but a rational calculator who had simply abandoned all moral constraints in pursuit of survival. What makes the Wilson Creek case particularly disturbing is how the survivors later described the psychological adaptation that occurred during this period. The men did not descend into chaos or savagery. Instead, they maintained elaborate pretenses of civilization and procedure. Meetings were conducted with formal votes. Executions were carried out with what they considered to be minimal cruelty. Meals were eaten at regular times, with the meat prepared in ways that disguised its source as much as possible. They convinced themselves that they were maintaining their humanity through these procedures, even as the very nature of what they were doing revealed how completely their humanity had been abandoned. The third man executed under the selection system was James Morrison, one of the original 5 who had voted against it. Morrison had maintained a careful silence after watching Brennan and Chen die, hoping that keeping his objections to himself would make him less of a target. But by late February, the camp population had dwindled to 8 men, and the original dissenters represented too large a portion of remaining survivors to ignore. Whitfield argued that Morrison's previous vote against the system indicated a lack of commitment to group survival, and the vote went as it always did. Morrison begged for his life, offering to change his vote, to support any future selections, to do whatever they asked. His pleas were ignored, and he died screaming in the snow outside the camp. By March 1st, 1849, 7 men remained alive. The winter had begun to show the first signs of eventually breaking, with slightly warmer daytime temperatures and occasional periods when the snow developed a crust that might, in theory, support a man's weight for short distances. But escape remained effectively impossible, and the group had long since passed the point where they could simply wait for spring and walk out. They had become a murder cult, bound together by shared guilt and by the terrible recognition that anyone who survived to reach civilization would have to explain what had happened in that canyon. This recognition created a new dynamic in the camp that would prove crucial to understanding the final phase of the Wilson Creek horror. The men began to realize that there would eventually be witnesses to their crimes, and that those witnesses might testify against them. The survivors might face murder charges, might be hanged for what they had done. This fear created a perverse incentive to reduce the number of survivors, to minimize the number of people who could testify about the systematic killings. Fewer survivors meant fewer witnesses, and it also meant more food per person remaining. The 4th and 5th selections, which occurred in early March, eliminated 2 more of the original dissenters. Robert Hayes and Patrick Sullivan, both Irish immigrants who had initially opposed the selection system, were chosen in rapid succession. By March 10th, only 5 men remained, and significantly, all 5 were from the original group of 7 who had supported Whitfield's system. The 2 members of that group who had died were Peter Sullivan and Thomas O'Brien, both of whom had succumbed to illness before the selection system was even proposed. The pattern was clear. The men who had voted for murder had systematically eliminated those who had opposed it, ensuring that only true believers in the selection system would survive to tell the tale. But with only 5 men left, a new problem emerged. They had eliminated the dissenters, but now they faced the question of whether to continue the selections among themselves. They were all equally complicit in what had happened. None could claim moral superiority over the others, and yet the logic of the system they had created suggested that further reductions might be necessary to ensure that someone survived until escape became possible or rescue arrived. Whitfield called a meeting on March 12 to address this question. The 5 survivors, huddled in the largest cabin, faced each other with a mixture of exhaustion, suspicion, and grim calculation. Whitfield proposed that they suspend further selections unless conditions became truly desperate, arguing that 5 men had a reasonable chance of all surviving until spring if they supplemented their current meat supply with any game they could hunt or trap. The proposal was less about mercy than about recognizing that further reducing their numbers might leave too few men to accomplish the work necessary for survival and eventual escape. The other 4 men agreed to Whitfield's proposal, though the agreement was tentative and clearly subject to revision if circumstances changed. For the next 3 weeks, the 5 survivors maintained an uneasy peace. They consumed the preserved meat from their previous victims, they attempted to hunt for additional food, and they waited for the snow to melt enough to make escape possible. But the psychological damage of what they had done had fundamentally altered their relationships with each other and with themselves. The journal entries from late March show Whitfield struggling with the recognition of what he had become. He wrote about nightmares in which the dead men returned to accuse him. He wrote about moments of doubt where he questioned whether survival was worth the price they had paid. But he also wrote about his determination to make it out alive, to return to civilization, and to justify what had happened as tragic necessity rather than evil choice. He was already constructing the narrative he would tell if he survived, a story that would minimize his role and present the cannibalism as a response to impossible circumstances rather than as organized murder. By early April, the snow had melted enough in some areas to make travel theoretically possible, though still extremely dangerous. The 5 survivors debated whether to attempt escape immediately or wait for better conditions. Whitfield argued for waiting, but 2 of the other men, Friedrich Handel and William Blackwood, insisted that they had to try now or risk being trapped until late spring. The debate became heated, with accusations being thrown about who had been most responsible for the murders and who had consumed the most meat. On April 7th, an event occurred that would determine the final composition of survivors and set the stage for the eventual discovery of the camp. Handel and Blackwood, without consulting the other 3, decided to make an escape attempt on their own. They gathered what remained of the preserved meat, took the best equipment and departed at dawn, hiking down the canyon towards Sacramento. Whitfield, discovering their departure, was furious, arguing that they had taken more than their fair share of supplies and had reduced the chances of the remaining 3 surviving until better escape conditions developed. What Whitfield did not know was that Handel and Blackwood's departure was less about escaping danger and more about escaping witnesses. The 2 men had apparently concluded that fewer survivors meant fewer people who could testify about what had happened, and they believed that if only the 2 of them made it out alive, they could control the narrative entirely. They could claim that all the deaths had been natural, that the cannibalism had been limited to consuming those who had died from starvation and cold, and that they were heroes who had survived impossible conditions. But their plan failed in a way that would eventually expose the entire truth. 3 days after leaving the camp, Handel and Blackwood encountered a rescue party that had been sent into the mountains specifically to search for missing miners. The rescue party, led by a former military officer named Captain Richard Morrison, had received reports from Sacramento about various mining camps that had not been heard from since the early winter storms. The Wilson Creek camp was one of several they were investigating. Handel and Blackwood, exhausted and near death from their escape attempt, were found by Morrison's party on April 10th. They immediately told a story about being the sole survivors of a camp where all the other men had died from starvation and disease. They claimed they had been forced to consume the dead to survive, but insisted that no one had been killed. Morrison, suspicious of their story and experienced enough to recognize when men were lying, decided to follow them back to the camp to verify their account and search for any other survivors. What Captain Morrison and his rescue party discovered when they reached the Wilson Creek camp on April 14th would shock California and eventually the entire nation. The three men remaining in camp, Whitfield, Henry Cooper, and James Davidson, were alive but in terrible condition. More significantly, the evidence of what had occurred was everywhere. The journal that Whitfield had kept, documenting the votes, the selections, and the systematic killings, was found in one of the cabins. The butchering area outside still showed clear signs of recent use, and most damningly, the bodies of the dead, or what remained of them after processing, were found preserved in the snow at various locations around the camp. The rescue party took all 5 survivors into custody, confiscated Whitfield's journal and all other evidence, and began the difficult process of piecing together exactly what had happened in that frozen canyon during the winter of 1848 to 1849. What they discovered would lead to one of the most controversial trials in early California history, and would raise questions about the nature of survival, the limits of human morality, and the difference between tragic necessity and calculated murder. The trial of the 5 Wilson Creek survivors began on June 12, 1849, in Sacramento, just 2 months after their rescue from the Sierra Nevada mountains. The case immediately became a sensation throughout California and beyond, with newspapers from San Francisco to New York providing detailed coverage of what was being called the most horrific crime in gold rush history. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity every day of the trial, with hundreds of spectators crowding into every available space and thousands more gathering outside, hoping for news of the proceedings. The question facing the court was not whether the men had killed and consumed their fellow miners. The evidence for that was overwhelming, but whether their actions constituted murder or tragic survival necessity. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Samuel Henderson, a former Massachusetts lawyer who had come to California seeking fortune, but had instead found his calling in bringing order to the chaos of gold rush society. Henderson understood that the Wilson Creek case would set precedents for how California dealt with extreme survival situations, and he was determined to establish that there were moral and legal lines that could not be crossed, regardless of circumstances. His strategy was to prove that the 5 defendants had not simply resorted to cannibalism to survive, but had established a systematic murder operation that went far beyond any reasonable definition of survival necessity. The defense was handled by 3 different attorneys, each representing different defendants who had somewhat conflicting interests. Jonathan Whitfield was represented by Edward Chambers, a skilled criminal defense lawyer from San Francisco, who argued that his client had been trying to maintain order and maximize survival chances in an impossible situation. Friedrich Handel and William Blackwood shared an attorney, Marcus Welch, who focused on arguing that his clients had been following orders from Whitfield and had attempted to escape and seek help as soon as conditions permitted. Henry Cooper and James Davidson were represented by Thomas Burke, who took a different approach by arguing that his clients had been coerced into participation by fear of becoming victims themselves. The key piece of evidence was Whitfield's journal, which had been preserved by Captain Morrison's rescue party, and which provided a detailed record of everything that had occurred at the Wilson Creek camp from the first snowstorm through the final days before rescue. The journal entries, read aloud in court, created a chilling portrait of systematic murder, disguised as rational survival planning. Whitfield had documented the votes on establishing the selection system, the criteria used for choosing victims, the methods of execution, and even calculations about how much meat each body provided, and how long it would sustain the survivors. Particularly damning were entries that showed Whitfield's evolving justifications for the killings. Early entries expressed regret and presented the selection system as a tragic necessity, but later entries showed a disturbing shift toward viewing the murders as simply logical resource management, with Whitfield writing about the victims in terms normally reserved for livestock or game animals. He had even created rankings of the remaining men based on their usefulness, essentially creating a kill list that determined the order in which they would be selected if further reductions became necessary. The prosecution called several expert witnesses to establish that the defendants had not been in immediate danger of death from starvation at the time the selection system was implemented. A physician who had examined the 5 survivors testified that while they were malnourished and weakened, they were not close to death and could likely have survived for several more weeks on minimal rations combined with whatever small game they could trap or hunt. A mountaineer with extensive experience in the Sierra Nevada testified that while the winter of 1848 to 1849 had been severe, it was not unprecedented, and that other mining camps in similar situations had survived without resorting to cannibalism or murder. The prosecution also presented testimony from members of Captain Morrison's rescue party about the condition of the camp when they arrived. The witnesses described finding clear evidence of systematic butchering operations, with tools and workspaces that indicated practiced efficiency rather than desperate improvisation. They described the locations where bodies had been preserved in the snow, some showing signs of having been carefully processed and stored for future consumption. And they described the demeanor of the 5 survivors, noting that Whitfield in particular had seemed more concerned about how the situation would be perceived than about expressing remorse for what had occurred. But perhaps the most powerful prosecution testimony came from the reading of statements that some of the victims had apparently written before their deaths. Several of the men who had opposed the selection system had kept their own journals or had written letters that they hoped would someday reach their families. These documents, found among the personal effects preserved at the camp, provided first-hand accounts of the terror and despair experienced by men who knew they were likely to be selected for execution but were powerless to prevent it. One particularly haunting letter was written by Marcus Brennan, the first man executed under the selection system, and was addressed to his wife and children back in New York. Brennan wrote that he had opposed the systematic killing from the start, that he had argued it was murder regardless of the circumstances, and that he now faced the certainty of being selected because of his moral objection. He described his fear, his desperation, and his recognition that the men he had trusted as fellow miners had become something monstrous. The letter ended with a plea that his family remember him as a man who had maintained his principles even when doing so cost him his life. The defense faced the enormous challenge of justifying actions that appeared indefensible when examined outside the context of the desperate situation in which they occurred. Whitfield's attorney, Edward Chambers, attempted to argue that his client had been trying to maintain order and rationality in circumstances that would have driven lesser men to chaos and savagery. He presented Whitfield not as a murderer, but as a leader who had made impossible choices in an effort to ensure that at least some of the 19 men would survive to return to their families and report what had happened. Chambers called witnesses who testified about the severity of the winter of 1848, emphasizing that the snow depths and temperatures were unprecedented in California history and that the Wilson Creek camp had been more isolated than almost any other mining operation in the Sierra Nevada. He presented testimony from other miners about the frequency with which entire camps had been wiped out by starvation, disease, or exposure during that terrible winter. And he argued that Whitfield's organization and planning, however horrific it appeared in retrospect, had actually saved the lives of the 5 survivors who would otherwise have all perished. The defense also attempted to draw moral and legal distinctions between different types of cannibalism. They argued that consuming the bodies of men who had died naturally from starvation or disease, which had occurred with the first few deaths, was morally and legally different from killing men to consume them. They suggested that the line between the two had been blurred by desperation and by the gradual recognition that random deaths might not occur frequently enough to sustain the survivors until rescue or escape became possible. Friedrich Handel and William Blackwood's attorney, Marcus Welch, took a different approach by attempting to minimize his client's roles in the decision-making process. He argued that Handel and Blackwood had simply followed Whitfield's leadership and had participated in the votes and executions because refusing to do so would have made them targets for selection themselves. He pointed out that his clients had attempted to escape and seek help as soon as conditions permitted, suggesting that they had recognized the evil of what was happening and had tried to end it by bringing outside intervention. Henry Cooper and James Davidson's attorney, Thomas Burke, went even further by arguing that his clients had been essentially hostages in a situation controlled by Whitfield and the other stronger men. He presented testimony suggesting that Cooper and Davidson had only participated in the votes and executions because they feared being killed if they refused. Burke argued that his clients were victims almost as much as the men who had died, forced to become accomplices to murder through fear for their own lives. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with the jury hearing testimony from over 40 witnesses and examining hundreds of pages of documentary evidence. The jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching their verdicts on July 3, 1849. The verdicts revealed both the complexity of the case and the jury's recognition that not all 5 defendants bore equal responsibility for what had occurred. Jonathan Whitfield was found guilty of first-degree murder on 8 counts, representing the 8 men who had been systematically selected and executed under the system he had proposed and organized. The jury concluded that Whitfield had not simply responded to desperate circumstances, but had created and implemented a murder operation that went far beyond any reasonable definition of survival necessity. Given the number of victims and the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, the jury recommended that Whitfield be sentenced to death by hanging. Friedrich Handel and William Blackwood were found guilty of second-degree murder on 5 counts each, representing the selections that had occurred after they had voted to establish the system but before they had attempted to escape. The jury apparently accepted the argument that they had been following Whitfield's leadership but held them responsible for their participation in votes and executions. They were sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Henry Cooper and James Davidson were found guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 3 counts each, with the jury apparently accepting that they had participated primarily out of fear for their own lives. They were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment each, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. The judge, in pronouncing sentence on July 5, 1849, delivered a statement that summarized the moral and legal issues the case had raised. He acknowledged that the defendants had faced circumstances of extreme hardship and that survival instincts were powerful forces that could drive people to actions they would never consider under normal circumstances. But he emphasized that society could not allow the excuse of necessity to justify systematic murder, regardless of the circumstances in which it occurred. The law, he stated, drew clear lines between consuming the dead to survive and killing the living to eat them, and those lines had to be maintained even in the most desperate situations. The execution of Jonathan Whitfield took place on August 15, 1849, at the Sacramento Territorial Prison. Over 3,000 spectators gathered to witness the hanging, and newspapers provided detailed coverage of the event. According to witnesses, Whitfield maintained his composure as he mounted the scaffold, though he declined the opportunity to make a final statement. Some observers reported that he appeared to have aged dramatically during his months of imprisonment, looking more like a man in his 60s than someone in his early 40s. He was pronounced dead 12 minutes after the trapdoor opened, and his body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. The fates of the other 4 survivors varied significantly. Friedrich Handel died in prison in 1857, succumbing to tuberculosis at age 43. He had never expressed remorse for his actions, and had maintained until his death that he had simply done what was necessary to survive. William Blackwood survived his imprisonment and was paroled in 1876 after serving 27 years. He moved to Oregon under an assumed name and lived quietly until his death in 1891, never speaking publicly about his experiences at Wilson Creek. Henry Cooper was paroled in 1861 after serving 12 years. He returned to his home state of Pennsylvania, where he lived under his own name but avoided all discussion of his past. He died in 1878 at age 62, taking his memories of that terrible winter to his grave. James Davidson was also paroled in 1861 and moved to Nevada, where he worked as a ranch hand until his death in 1883. Like Cooper, he never spoke publicly about Wilson Creek. The Wilson Creek case had lasting impacts on how California law dealt with survival situations and necessity defenses. The precedent established by the trial made clear that while consumption of the dead might be legally defensible under extreme circumstances, systematic selection and killing of victims could never be justified, regardless of how desperate the situation became. The case was cited in legal textbooks and court decisions for decades afterward as an example of the limits of the necessity defense in criminal law. The case also contributed to improved safety measures for mining camps in remote locations. California authorities began requiring that camps above certain elevations maintain minimum food supplies sufficient for extended isolation, that they establish communication protocols with lower elevation settlements, and that they develop evacuation plans for use before conditions became impassable. While these measures could not prevent all tragedies, they did reduce the frequency with which camps found themselves in the kind of desperate isolation that had led to the Wilson Creek horror. From a psychological perspective, the Wilson Creek case raised questions about human behavior under extreme stress that remained largely unanswered with the scientific understanding of the time. How did apparently normal men convince themselves that systematic murder was justified? What psychological mechanisms allowed them to maintain elaborate pretenses of civilization and procedure while committing acts of horror? How did the voting system and careful documentation serve to diffuse individual responsibility and make participation in murder feel more acceptable? These questions would be studied by psychologists and sociologists for generations, with the Wilson Creek case becoming a reference point for understanding how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil under certain circumstances. The families of the 13 victims faced the unique tragedy of knowing exactly how their loved ones had died, but being unable to recover remains for proper burial. The bodies had been too thoroughly processed and consumed to allow for individual identification, and what little remained had been buried in a mass grave near the campsite by the rescue party. In the years following the trial, several families traveled to California hoping to visit the site, but the location was remote and difficult to access, and many found that actually seeing the place where their relatives had been murdered and cannibalized brought more pain than closure. The Wilson Creek mining campsite itself was abandoned after the rescue, and within a few years nature had begun to reclaim the area. The cabins gradually collapsed under the weight of winter snows, the cleared areas grew over with vegetation, and the canyon returned to wilderness. By the late 1800s, few physical traces remained of what had occurred there, though local residents continued to tell stories about the cannibal camp and to warn travelers about the dangers of being unprepared for Sierra Nevada winters. Today, more than 175 years after the Wilson Creek horror, the case remains one of the most disturbing episodes in California gold rush history. The site is now part of a national forest, with no marker indicating what occurred there. The victims remain largely forgotten, except by their descendants and by historians who study the darker aspects of westward expansion. But the case serves as a permanent reminder that the pursuit of fortune can lead to costs far beyond financial loss, that desperation can drive people to abandon their humanity, and that the line between survival and murder is one that must be carefully maintained even in the most extreme circumstances. The legacy of Jonathan Whitfield and the Wilson Creek camp is one of horror, but also of the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even when survival instincts scream for their abandonment. Their story reminds us that civilization is a fragile construct, that the veneer of humanity can be stripped away by hunger and fear, but also that even in the most desperate circumstances we retain the choice to remain human or to become monsters. 13 men died in that frozen canyon, murdered by men they had trusted as friends and fellow miners. Their deaths serve as testimony to what humans become when they convince themselves that necessity justifies any action, and their story remains a warning that echoes across the centuries.